Some prison scenes in this film are dramatized to convey the likely experience of Joan of Arc. The trial verdict and key legal facts are based on historical records. The candle in the narrow cell has burned down to a fat, trembling wick. Smoke threads upward and disappears into the rafters. The flame throws Joan's face into a restless map of shadow and light. She sits on a pallet of straw and linen, her hands folded where they will not be seen to tremble. Beyond the thick oak, footsteps come and go on stone, deliberate, never hurried, boots that mark the passage of long hours as much as they mark the passage of men paid to be patient. A knock, quiet as a pebble in a shallow pool. A guard's voice muffled through the shuttered doorway. The exchange is brief. A question, a curt answer, the scrape of a key. Sleep, when it arrives, is always tentative, broken between the rhythm of the corridor and the echo of her own memory, the memory of banners, of sunlight on a horse's neck, of faces raised in hope. Once she moved through the world with people's expectation like heat around her. Now the cell is a small measured cold that contracts around the body and the name. Imagine that sound, the slow reclaiming of another life, night after night, until the edges of self are rubbed thin. That slow reclamation is not a single violent act, but a ritual, an orchestrated erosion designed to make a woman whose authority grew in open fields unmoored and alone. They did not need to strike her down outright. They had more subtle work, to rearrange evidence, to reframe kindness as manipulation, to let hope be a commodity controlled from outside the door. She was young, still a teenager by the reckoning of her time, when she rose from the village of Domremy to carry a banner into battle. That rise was improbable enough to be called miraculous by some and dangerous by others. Reports written by men in robes and reports whispered by soldiers differed in tone but not in consequence. When fortune shifted and she was captured at Compiègne in May of 1430, she passed from the uncertain protection of French allies into a custody that had aims far beyond holding a prisoner. Her captors did not simply want a captive, they wanted a story, and stories can be made to fit the shape of power. The basic facts are recorded, captured during the rout at Compiègne, transferred into Burgundian hands, and ultimately sold to English authorities. She arrived in Rouen under guarded escort and entered a legal apparatus prepared to treat her as a problem that needed solving. That much the documents agree on. The moments of capture, the transfer, the trial that followed in the winter of 1430-1431. What the trial records cannot fully capture is the small-scale choreography of a cell at night, the way deliberate noises wake a prisoner again and again, the way a candle reduced to a stub becomes a measure of days. If this narrative seems clinical in its details, consider for a moment the counterpoint. The weather of the world outside those thick walls. Joan had once ridden under blue sky toward the gates of Orléans and Reims. Townsfolk had peered from windows as banners passed overhead. In churches, priests blessed the movement. She tasted the wind and imagined destiny as a road ahead. The transfer from that open world to a cell in Rouen is not simply a change of location. It is a conversion of a public life into private uncertainty, and in that vacuum, others' stories are allowed to be written for her. The men who guarded her were not a single type. Some were soldiers who had seen too many sieges to be surprised by a woman's courage. Others wore the frock of a garrison warder and the indifference of routine. A few might even have shown moments of courtesy, an extra blanket, the bringing of bread still warm, gestures small enough to be quoted later as evidence of humane treatment. That was the point. True cruelty often makes use of ordinary decency. It softens the suspicion of those who watch. The ritual began at the edges, removal from the places where she could be seen and spoken to freely, a tightening of access that presented allies with the choice of appearing at the wrong place at the wrong time. Letters that might have passed to her were intercepted or delayed. Messengers returned with stories of gates watched. Her armor and her banner, symbols of what she had been, were kept away from her reach. In their place, plain cloth. In their place, sermons and questions that disguised themselves as charity. You can imagine the small tactics as a kind of slow arithmetic against a human mind. Deny sleep long enough and memory phrase. Permit speech only in the presence of witnesses who do not represent her community. Stage contradictions in testimony until truth becomes a shifting thing. The guards knew this arithmetic. They arranged for her to hear certain names only in whispers, to see certain faces only through iron bars, and to experience kindness as an instrument rather than a gift. Each action by itself could be excused or explained. Together, they form a strategy. But this was not only a prisoner's work, it was the work of a legal theater. By the time she stood before ecclesiastical interrogators, the state had assembled an account of her life that bent toward condemnation. The ecclesiastical court in Rouen, organized under figures aligned with English interests, was tasked with the translation of spiritual claims into legal categories. Voices trained in canon law and the rhetoric of heresy interrogated the meaning of visions and the propriety of dress. For men who read theology in marginal notes, the line between divine guidance and diabolical suggestion could be argued into apparent clarity. They paid particular attention to gendered signs. Her wearing of male clothing, reported in several accounts, was treated not only as a matter of fashion or practicality, but as a sign with theological implication. In the clerical imagination, clothing could mean allegiance. Male dress suggested a rejection of female modesty, they argued. It suggested a refusal of God's ordained order. To the woman who had taken up arms and armor to serve a cause she believed was divine, clothes were a protection. To her judges, clothes became evidence. And yet the machinery that put her on trial was not simple or monotone. Witnesses appeared, some summoned from the town squares, some brought under pressure. Testimonies, when read aloud, were woven into a larger cloth. Where statements did not align, the court did what courts often do. It chose the version that made a coherent narrative for the prosecution. It weighed contradictions against the accused. When the accused was a young woman who insisted she had heard voices, the court operated with assumptions that stacked the deck. What looked like certainty on the bench could be manufactured in the corridor. These things, removal of allies, controlled communication, curated testimony, were not unique innovations. They were tactics adapted to the medieval setting, drawing on habits of interrogation and public spectacle. The novelty, if any, lay in their application to a woman whose celebrity was both blessing and threat. The more people believed Joan had been sent by God, the more urgently those in power felt compelled to rewrite that belief as dangerous seduction. In the cell, the night was a long ledger of small losses. A guard would come to examine the bedding at odd hours under the pretext of slovenly straw. Another would stand in the doorway and hum a hymn off-key until words and sleep tangled. When a priest finally came, often after a delay that served the purposes of the court, his questions were not only spiritual but legal. He could present the option of reconciliation with the church in terms that suggested escape, renounce, repent, wear the appropriate garment, and the world might bend in your favor. The offer was simple on the surface, monstrous in its implication. Admit the possibility your visions were not from God. Admit they might be false. Perhaps you will be spared. To a prisoner cut off from counsel and comrades, that offer is a calculus not only of faith, but survival. Historians debate the moment-by-moment truth of what passed between Joan and particular clerics. The transcript of her trial, taken down by clerks at Rouen, shows her struggling with questions about obedience and divine command. She answered insistently, and sometimes evasively, partly from fatigue, sometimes from a refusal to let the language of others redefine her own experience. She used deflection and silence as a shield. The men who designed the ritual of breaking counted on the shield wearing thin. An essential mechanism in their strategy was the harvesting of witness statements crafted to undermine her consistency. The court assembled a gallery of testimonial fragments, neighbors who had seen her in men's clothing, soldiers who had heard her speak of saints, family acquaintances who remembered an alleged unorthodoxy in childhood. Each fragment could be emphasized or minimized depending on the line the court needed. Contradictions between witnesses were folded into a narrative that made her seem unreliable by design. And then there were threats that extended beyond her own body. Those who had rallied to her cause, captains, townsfolk, kin, found themselves watched and, in some cases, attacked or arrested. The purpose was twofold: to make allies wary of association and to signal to the prisoner that resistance produced collateral cost. The anxiety of not knowing whether a friend was safe is a pressure that presses like brine. Letters carried in secret could be seized. Envoys sent with money or reprieve could be detained. News could be fabricated. The uncertainty was a slow, gnawing instrument, and it often worked better than sword or iron. When interrogations were publicized to serve as spectacle, the intent shifted slightly. Information not only stripped an individual of agency, it reshaped public sentiment. The courthouses of Rouen saw not only clerics and clerks, but also curiosity. Townspeople, foreign emissaries, soldiers with idle time. A verdict rendered in a space where the crowd could witness the humiliation functioned as a demonstration. To the watching public, a confession could appear like a ceiling stroke. To the court, the spectacle completed the work of law by converting private pressure into communal sanction. But there were techniques at the human scale too, subtler than the theatrics of a courtroom. Guards sometimes refused to meet her eyes. Men who could have been kind chose professional indifference. Small mercies were disallowed on occasion to prove a point. A soldier who once laughed could now wait silently, as if he were unaware of her former glories. When the human imagination is starved of affirmation, it begins to accept alternative narratives offered by those in power. A life that had been loudly affirmed by villages and banners was now to be whispered into doubt. The sequence of breaks often began with sleep and appetite. Days in the cell became a loop of listless hours, interrupted by forced attendance at an interrogation, or by the arrival of a priest whose questions wore like sand across a surface. Time stretched oddly when it is measured by candle stubs. The flame's shortening was a clock the prisoner could see. Each remnant of light was a page torn from the calendar. Repetition forged a rhythm. The same guard at the same hour, the same question phrased differently, the same offer of mercy that sounded conditional on the surrender of a claim to God. At times, the pressure yielded results that satisfied the court's appetite for a neat resolution. Men and women who had been close to her, facing threats to property or family, sometimes gave statements that favored the prosecution. In the records, their names appear as willing participants. More often, circumstances reveal coercion, torture in the medieval sense that might include threats or the withholding of resources, or the promise of leniency in exchange for a cooperative testimony. The legal fiction was that testimony was free. The reality was more baroque and strategic. And yet Joan remained, to varying degrees, resistant. There are catalogued moments in the trial transcripts where she refused to name the content of voices, or where she refused to allow herself to be boxed into a simple confession. She sometimes answered with a return to the language of missions and saints, framing obedience as a duty and her visions as directives beyond her earthly control. Those answers, when given, did not always please the court. For men trained in the dialectics of heterodoxy, the language of divine command could be parsed to suggest deception. It is important to note the limits of what the records can and cannot tell us. Trial clerks recorded words. They did not record the soft things that happened between guards and prisoner, the muffled cries in the night, the exact measure of loneliness. Some scenes we dramatize because we must bridge archival silence with human imagination. The echo of a footfall, the smell of damp straw, the keening of someone far away. Where the archives are silent, we use plausible reconstruction, always careful to mark it as such. The historical core remains. She was captured, held in Rouen, tried by an ecclesiastical court under significant English influence, and executed on May 30th, 1431. The path between capture and execution is where the ritual of wearing down a person took shape in 1,000 small ways. Consider one night described in a convergence of documents and plausible scene-making. A priest came late, his cloak damp from the river wind. He did not speak in the straightforward cadence of prayer, but in the labored vocabulary of law and doctrine. He asked whether she had ever misinterpreted a voice. He suggested that sometimes the devil could take the guise of an angel. He offered reconciliation as a doorway. "Recant," he said in the court's later summation, "and you shall be spared." For a young woman who had been told by her own sense that she was called to act, the choice seemed to be between obedience to an otherworldly law she had always trusted, or admission to the earthly law enforced by men who measured her faith against their own fear. She understood, perhaps better than they did, that confession could be a shield. That knowledge shaped her responses in ways the clerks recorded with peculiar attention. On some days, she quibbled about words, whether a voice was from God or from another. On others, she said nothing, letting silence be a kind of answer. The court framed such silence as evasion. She might have seen silence as defiance or righteous reserve. Outside the cell, the tribunal worked to build conformity in narrative. They compared testimony, highlighted inconsistencies, and introduced questions that required her to comment on specific events, sometimes from years earlier, sometimes from the thin daylight of weeks ago. The technique was relentless. Ask about the small particulars, and let those particulars define the larger truth. In doing so, they made truth into a problem of memory, and memory into evidence. The mind, under pressure, may produce slips. Slips could be magnified in the courtroom into proof of duplicity. Another tool in the arsenal was the deliberate use of gendered humiliation without explicit physicality. Clerics and guards would emphasize her failure to conform to feminine norms as a legal infraction. They ridiculed, questioned, and minimized. Humiliation in public forums does two things. It detaches a person from their social capital, and it teaches the watching populace to scorn them as well. To strip a person of social respect is to weaken any army of support that person might muster. At the same time, the court understood the power of symbols. Banners, songs, the names of battles where she had led were all evidence not merely of action, but of influence. To neutralize her authority, they targeted the sources of that influence: her companions, the towns that cheered her, the priests who had blessed her. Arrests were not always publicized with fanfare. Often they occurred in the dark, in alleys and behind shutters, and the rumor spread faster than the truth. News that a captain had been detained was sufficient to induce a ripple of fear in communities that had once rallied to her cause. It is worth pausing on what breaking a person meant here. The most brutal thing the court could do was not always physical violence. It was the severing of social roots and reputational life. A person without allies is like a tree without roots. The cell, the curated testimony, the public humiliations, they all served to unmoor her. Execution was, in that sense, a final ceremonial cutting. Sometimes death freed a body from suffering. Sometimes it was the culminating spectacle that would forever brand her legend. For those who plotted her downfall, the best possible outcome was not merely death, but a death that appeared justified by law, by narrative, by force of testimony. In the weeks that followed her capture, a pattern emerges from the fragmentary accounts. She moved from one space to another. She was visited by men of learning and men of arms. She was questioned under oath, and then saw the questions reshaped into accusations. Offers of clemency circulated, sometimes in the form of hints whispered into the cell, sometimes as formal proposals in the council chambers. The moral calculus pressed on her. The cost of admission might spare her life, but it would also put her claim to divine guidance to the test in the harshest way. Was the truth of a vision worth the price of a confession? Could a single sentence uttered under duress cancel years of conviction? Those are the existential questions that the ritual sought to provoke. It was not enough to produce a confession. The court needed a confession that made sense to the public, that could be read back as a recantation of transcendence. The clerics wanted a narrative where the voice in her head was shown to be false, where her military deeds were stripped of sanctity, where the people who had once rallied behind her could now be safely realigned. A confession would do this with clean rhetorical force. It transforms a disruptive miracle into a personal mistake. Yet human beings rarely conform to the tidy scripts others write for them. In the slow calculus of her imprisonment, she offered moments that refused the comfortable categories presented to her interrogators. Sometimes she said the words they wanted, perhaps out of exhaustion, perhaps because it was a remonstrance with the world of men who had legal power. At other moments she retracted, sometimes with great public bravery. The documents record reversals and clarifications, evidence of a mind engaged in the impossible negotiation between inner conviction and external coercion. And then, abruptly, the machinery of the courthouse turned toward a particular drama. The prosecution, having gathered a gallery of statements and launched a campaign to frame her actions in narrowly heretical terms, set the stage for decisive questioning. The days leading to these sessions were punctuated by nights of ritual disturbance. The guard who paced the corridor twice before dawn, the priest who lingered longer at the threshold, the clerk whose parchment waited for a single misstep to be recorded. Pressure, after all, accumulates as both quantity and quality. 100 small pressures become a force as effective as a single, obvious blow. It is here, at this juncture, that we pause and let the image remain. A candle burning low, a girl still with the shape of battle in her shoulders, and the sound of a garrison's boots keeping time like a metronome. She has been in custody for months. News reaches her in fragments. Allies have been arrested or intimidated. The court is assembling its final case. Inside the cell, she closes her eyes and hears a voice she has always trusted. Outside, clerics prepare questions that will be asked in a lawful tongue. If you want the full historical unpacking of how these legal maneuvers were carried out and how the trial would eventually unfold, subscribe and stay with us as we follow the court's choreography and the private rites by which authority sought to remake a person in its own image. The next phase begins in a courtroom designed to look like an exercise in reason. Candles there are arranged on high stands, their flames small but steady under vaulted ceilings, stacked with the learned presence of men in robes. The judges speak in Latin and French. The clerks write with an eye for theological nuance. For them, the machinery of law is a refinement of judgment, and the questions they ask are designed to produce answers that can be transcribed into verdict. They begin by examining the core issue. Authority. Who speaks for God? Who can claim a private voice and transform it into public action? The court has already decided who ought to have that authority. Now they must make it appear that the decision followed from evidence, not from politics. To do this, they call witnesses, and they cross-examine the very idea of divine intervention. The strategy is familiar even outside this case. Ask specificity about an alleged vision, and you force the visionary into a frame that can be proven false or inconsistent. Demand naming of saints and dates. Insist on a chain of communication that places the vision inside human chronology, and then compare those statements to prior ones. Where a deviation occurs, the court sees not human complexity, but fraud. When the accused wavers, the court marks it as guilt. There is an acuteness to some of the moments recorded in the trial. Questions about apparel, about whether she had slept with men, about whether she had ever prayed outside the church's rite. These questions wrap theological fear around social suspicion. They are designed to humiliate and to elicit compliance. For the prisoner, each question is a trap. Answer, and you may be used. Refuse, and you may be punished. The breadth of the trap is political. The court was not merely determining the fate of one woman, it was defining who could claim authority in a time of contested kingship and uncertain borders. The accused's responses were both stubborn and strategic. She refused to be easily categorized. Sometimes she answered directly. Sometimes she responded evasively. Sometimes she leaned on the language of obedience to God rather than obedience to the court. Each answer was recorded, parsed, and then placed into a public ledger that would be read for years to come. The trial's clerks had a peculiar power. Their ink could transform nuance into definitive line. At this point, the ritual's gears begin to show their wear. The prosecution presses for a condemnation that can be publicly justified. The defense scrambles to fashion a reply from fragments of evidence, piety, and the stubborn testimony of a woman who still believed in her calling. Outside the hall, delegations consult and newspapers, if we can call them that in their medieval equivalent, carry accounts that shape wagging tongues and fearful hearts. The world beyond Rouen watches, and the court knows the importance of a verdict that will travel. But before the chamber can pronounce a final sentence, the work of the guards and the clerics converges again into the private spaces where the accused sleeps. There are nights when the questions asked in the chamber are rehearsed in the cell, when a priest plants the next day's wording with the carefulness of a man arranging a trap. There are nights when the accused is allowed, by accident or design, to see a face she once trusted. That face may appear to give comfort, and then, once the doors close, will be read back by the court as evidence of manipulation or of confession. The confusion is the instrument's blade. The sequence of pressure and performance is what makes the trial not just a legal proceeding but a moral theater. Each participant knows his role. The judge must appear impartial, the prosecutor must appear righteous, the prisoner must appear either penitent or obstinate. The public will adjudge the outcome according to what they are shown. In such a context, truth is both what happened and what can be made to appear convincingly in front of witnesses. As winter approaches in Rouen, the candles flame and the corridor's footsteps become not merely motifs, but measures. Days collapse into each other beneath the court's heavy scrutiny. For Joan, the question is no longer only one of words, but of survival. What do words cost? What does a single utterance mean when the body has been held in a place designed to unmake it? The clerics ask, the guards watch, the court writes, and the world waits. At the threshold of the court's next proceeding, the ritual has performed most of its work. Allies have been cowed into silence. Testimony has been curated to present a consistent narrative. The cell's nights have taught lessons in solitude, and in how the human mind can be shaped by the steady drip of constraint. The next session promises to press her to a decisive moment, to renew the claim of divine calling, or to recant under the weight of all that has been done to her and to those she loves. We leave her then in the candlelight, at the point where a new day will soon demand an answer. The question waiting is not merely of personal belief, it is a question of political symbol and legal precedent. Whether she will bend or not is the hinge on which the courthouse apparatus hopes public memory will turn. The mechanics of that hinge, how testimony will be used, how offers will be made, how humiliation will be weaponized, are the very ritual we have been tracing. The court prepares its questions. The guards make their rounds. The city outside breathes and waits. The day that followed the night of endless questions begins in small movements. A man closing a ledger, the scrape of a stool, a candle rekindled as if to prove the world still turns. A clerk lifts his quill, and the room leans closer. For those who watch the law like a performance, the hour of reckoning is not a sudden thunderclap, but a long, rehearsed aria. The judges enter with the air of men performing an inevitable role. The prosecution arrives with its bundle of curated statements, the defense arrives with a handful of scraps, and the stubborn loyalty of a few who remain unbroken. Outside, the city gathers in patches, curiosity, dread, the ordinary business of life. Inside, one small figure who once rode under banners takes her place on a low bench, and the ritual assembled by men in robes swings toward its climax. The court's first pastoral move is to make the scene appear as clinical as possible. Latin phrases are used to shroud force, and legal forms are invoked as instruments of mercy. Men trained to reduce mystery to categorization ask about particulars, names of saints, the circumstances of visions, the times when doors were closed against prayer. Each question is a lever. Each lever is designed to move a simple thing, public belief, into place. The guards, who have kept the rhythm of the nights, now keep distance at the edge of the chamber. Their presence is a reminder that law here is supported by muscle. It has been the pattern from the start. Legal structures articulated the reasons. The quieter apparatus outside the law supplied the pressure. On the parchment the court favors, an abjuration begins to take shape. It is not an instantaneous stroke of pen, but a document formed by 1,000 small compromises between words chosen and words omitted. The clerics who draft it know what the world must be told, that the visions were not divine directives, that the young woman, however courageous, erred, that the nation need not fear the shape of sacred authority being bent by one mortal's claim. The language skirts theological questions in favor of legal safety. What the document achieves, in effect, is a conversion of mystery to manageable narrative, a tidy ending to a story that had once been dangerously open. We cannot and must not pretend we know the private negotiations that preceded the signature. The trial transcripts indicate an abjuration on May 24, 1431, where Joan, in the presence of clerical authorities, made a formal statement renouncing certain claims about her visions and agreeing to live in the habits prescribed by the Church. This is the historical record. The moment of signing, as often happens at the junction between public pressure and private peril, carried a complexity the ink alone cannot show. There were practical considerations, an offer of life, and spiritual ones. What language would, in the eyes of God and men, be truthful? The document's form promised an end to the legal jeopardy she faced. For the state that wished to neutralize her as a symbol of divine intervention, the abjuration would serve both as legal shelter and as a public memorandum of defeat. Yet papers and signatures do not erase months of ritual work. Even after an abjuration is given, the machinery of control can continue to apply pressure in quieter ways, testing the limits of any agreement. For Joan, the act of renouncing certain formulations was not the same as conceding the inner certainty that had borne her to battle. The records suggest that she signed the abjuration perhaps with a mixture of weariness, calculation, and hope for survival. She had been a child of the fields less than 2 decades before. The world of clerical rhetoric and legal distinction was an unfamiliar arena. If the abjuration offered a way to live, it also demanded that she surrender a piece of the story that had saved so many. That is a wrenching price. The days after the abjuration were full of watchful moments. Guards monitored her movements with renewed attentiveness, not simply to enforce obedience, but to record any deviation that might be read back as relapse. There were visits, some official and some performed under the veneer of pastoral care, that tested boundaries. Men who once negotiated in the open, captains, clerics, foreign envoys, now negotiated around inked words. The ritual that had worn her down had accomplished its immediate legal aim. The larger aim, however, was still at work, to change public perception. For courts and kings, a single public retraction could be more potent than months of testimony. In the weeks that followed, the smallest choices in a prisoner's life were surveilled and interpreted. Clothing became a sign not of practicality, but of allegiance. To wear a man's doublet was not simply to guard against cold, but, to the court's logic, to defy an order that expected women to present themselves in a specific way. The medieval imagination about dress carried theological weight for the clerics in Rouen. To them, a reversal could signal repentance. A return to the prior habit could be read as ill intent or relapsing contumacy. The guard's role in this phase was not only to enforce outward appearance, but to read inward states from outward signs. That was the ritual's violent genius. By rendering private conviction legible through public body language, power could use the visible to criminalize the invisible. On May 29th, Though the abjuration had been recorded days earlier, the chain of events that followed is where conjecture and record overlap. The documents note that Joan was taken to attend a sermon and that she put on a dress again at some moment before the final sentence. The exact circumstances remain contested among scholars. Accounts vary on whether her return to male attire was a deliberate act of defiance, a practical decision, or a reaction to the complex pressures around her. We mark that scene as a point where small acts were assigned outsized meaning. A change of garment, in an environment that had made clothing into evidence, became a test. Was the agreement sincere? Had she relapsed? This is the place where the ritual's architecture becomes most apparent. The guards who had paced at night, the clerics who had composed the language of renunciation, the public who had watched, each had their expectations and thresholds for what counted as genuine repentance. For those who wanted a decisive conclusion, a symbolic misstep could be used to tidy the narrative. It could catalyze the transformation from conditional clemency to final condemnation. Thus, within days, the question of whether she had relapsed crystallized into a legal framework that allowed the court to pronounce sentence once more, this time for the crime of relapse into heresy, which in their view voided the abjuration and restored the penalty. The execution that followed on May 30th, 1431, is a historical fact recorded by multiple contemporaries. She was burned in Rouen. The manner of execution is known in outline. What the records cannot convey fully is the weight that had accumulated in the weeks and months prior, the slow compression that made death part of a longer process of attrition. There are accounts of the crowd, of the procession through parts of the city, of the sight lines from which people watched. The spectacle was designed to be didactic. Here was the consequence of heterodoxy. Here was an exemplar of law made absolute. And yet, among the wooden frameworks and the watchful faces, there were also those who remembered banners and battled under her command, those who had once offered bread and blessing as she rode by. Memory is never uniform in such moments. Spectacle and remembrance coexist like opposing currents. What is crucial for us to understand is the longer violence of the ritual, not only the flame, but the months that prepared the tinder. The guards had performed a steady work of attrition, interrupting sleep, denying consistent counsel, shaping the terms of communication, orchestrating the gallery of witness statements, allowing public displays to humiliate and unroot supporters. Each act alone could be defended as routine. Together they formed a systematic campaign to remake a person's political meaning. The trial converted that campaign into law. The execution converted the law into a public lesson. The final act made a neat story of a complex life, and the neat story has been what many generations received. Yet when we pull at the threads, the filaments of procedure and pressure reveal an architecture intended to produce a result that the state could narrate as proper. There were human consequences not only for Joan, but for those tied to her. Families of supporters were pushed into penury or ostracized. Captains who rallied under her standard were dismembered, politically, socially, by a system that needed to neutralize the network that had supported her. The ritual of breaking operates on more than one body. It extends outward like a tide, drawing down those moored to the rock of reputation. Arrests, threats, confiscations of property. These were instruments used to signal to a populace that association carried risk. The deliberate fear that rippled through towns was as effective at extinguishing resistance as any sword. As the pages of the legal record close, the story enters another long phase. Remembrance, reinterpretation, rehabilitation. The immediate objective of the court in Rouen was achieved, the suppression of a living claim. Yet history does not remain satisfied with the tidy verdicts imposed in the moment. In 1456, a posthumous retrial authorized by the Dauphin Charles, the future Charles VII, examined the Rouen proceedings and concluded that the trial had been tainted and the sentence unjust. That rehabilitation, itself a public, political act, began the long process of reframing her life not as criminal, but as martyrdom. Centuries later, in 1920, the Church canonized her. These later acts did not undo the suffering she endured, but they attest to how narratives can be overturned, how institutions can be held to account by subsequent generations. It is worth pausing on what the later rehabilitation tells us about the nature of power and memory. The same mechanisms, law, public performance, clerical authority, that had once been used to dismantle her claim, were re-employed, over a century later, to restore her reputation. History is not a straight line. It is a palimpsest where meanings are inscribed, erased, and rescribed. For those who study institutional cruelty, that afterlife is instructive. Power does not only crush, it also constructs the terms by which its crushing will later be judged. The fact that her name moved from condemnation to sanctity illustrates both the contingency of legal verdicts and the endurance of human testimony that resists easy erasure. And yet there is a moral truth that runs through the whole sequence. The worst wounds are not always those that leave visible scars. The months in which her knights were broken, in which allies were intimidated, in which the apparatus of the court turned testimony into a weapon, the months in which memory itself was assaulted, are where the deepest damage can lie. The ritual of breaking is a process of social surgery. It removes a person's connections, cuts out the tissue of public trust, and leaves behind a body that can be easily disposed of when the legal machinery calls for it. Execution may have been the physical end, but the prior months had already functioned as a long execution of agency and reputation. We should be careful, in our judgment, to separate individuals from systemic imperatives. Many men who took part in the tribunals may have believed they acted within the bounds of law and conscience. Yet systems have shapes independent of personal intent. Within those shapes, small choices can become cruel in aggregate. The guards who paced the corridor, the clerics who fashioned legal language, the officials who arranged public displays, all acted inside an ecosystem of power that rewarded the neutralization of dissent. Condemnations that feel righteous in the moment often produce later regret. The work of historical inquiry is to reveal the mechanisms so that similar arrangements might be seen in our own time. In reconstructing such scenes, we rely on documents and chronicles. But where archival silence remains, we cautiously use imagination to bridge human feeling with the fragmentary record, dramatic reconstruction. When we hear the transcript's terse accounting of a signed paper, we must also imagine the private calculus behind the pen. When we read of a procession through Rouen, we should picture faces in the crowd, some satisfied at the display of order, some crushed by the spectacle. Imagination is not invention if it is disciplined by the archive. It is a tool for empathy that allows us to enter the texture of a life otherwise reduced to lines of ink. What remains after these events are not only historical facts, but living questions. How do institutions harness ordinary human behavior to produce extraordinary injustice? How do small acts of routine supervision, an extra knock at midnight, the silent refusal to meet a gaze, accumulate into the remaking of a person's identity? What cost do we exact from the young when we set them into arenas of public power without adequate protections? Joan of Arc's story forces us to confront the conjunction of youthful courage and organized coercion. She moved through the world at a perilous angle, claiming a private, divine authority in a time of fractious public contest. And the response of authorities was to neutralize that claim through a mixture of spectacle, legalism, and psychological attrition. Her legacy forces us to think about the language of martyrdom and the politics of memory. Saints are often made from people whom institutions once sought to destroy. Rehabilitation, in its way, is an admission that the moral arithmetic of the past was flawed. But the late recognition, rehabilitation centuries later, or canonization in the 20th century, cannot restore what was taken in the moment. It cannot return months of sleep stolen, friendships eroded, or the particular solitude of a cell. Those losses are the human ledger of institutional cruelty, and they are precisely what we must name if we wish to grasp the full moral geography of the case. There is, finally, an invitation implicit in this story. To remember Joan of Arc is not merely to recall a figure who changed the course of battle and later suffered a terrible fate. It is to study how power operates in small, continuous ways and how those mechanisms can be resisted or reformed. It is an exercise in empathy for those whose voices are undercut by official language, and a call to guard the rights of the vulnerable, especially young people who enter public life without the protections that should accompany civic responsibility. As the light fades on the scaffold in Rouen, the flame consumes what the state declared unlawful. But what survives in the longer historical record are not ashes but questions. Who wrote the law, and to whose advantage did it bend? Whose testimonies were heard, and who was made to appear incoherent by design? How much of justice is a matter of procedure, and how much is a question of courage in the face of procedural cruelty? These are not rhetorical flourishes, but the ethical coordinates by which later generations must measure their institutions. If you found this account meaningful, and you want to follow the detailed documents, the trial transcripts, and the later rehabilitation that complicates the simple verdict, there are sources and scholars that trace these events with care. You can find them in the description below. Remembering her is not an act of nostalgia but a turning of attention toward the mechanisms of power that are still active elsewhere, in other forms. Joan of Arc's end was a public act that the court framed as an exemplary legal moment. Her life, measured against that moment, tells a different story. One of a person whose claim to divine guidance collided with political interests and legal forms that sought to contain her. The ritual that the guards and clerics enacted, the nightly interruptions, the curated witness gallery, the transformation of kindness into instrument, was not simply about compliance. It was a comprehensive strategy to unmake an agent and make of her a cautionary tale. That tactic is a form of institutional violence as deliberate as it is mundane. We close with a simple remembrance that the measure of a society is how it treats those who are vulnerable to its mechanisms. Joan of Arc's life and death are a call to name the quiet forms of coercion, the knock in the night, the intercepted letter, the silence where counsel should be, that collectively can strip people of agency. To study her is to learn the grammar of such coercion so that we may, in our time, recognize it and resist it. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear how systems can break a person long before the final act is carried out. Talk about it, reflect on it, and consider what protections we owe to those who dare to speak and act beyond the channels others have prescribed.